Hi everyone, and I'm adding to the previous video. Um, I'm not sure if it's the right time to talk about the pre-trans fallacy quite yet, um, but I wanted to. So the for me, there's obviously many avenues in order to sort of produce a critique of Ken Wilber, and many of you have identified some of these in terms of the nature of hierarchies and rigidity of hierarchies and this kind of thing. But there's a couple of other places where to sort of come in with criticism. And it's always good to go back to what are the basic premises of something. So later we'll look at pre-trans fallacy. That's another place where Wilber's in for a major criticism. But let's start with what appears to be a very sort of deep premise within Wilber's work. And this could come under the heading of what is called in biology, or was called in biology, recapitulation theory. So, and there's this phrase that ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny in biology. And what this means is that evolutionary changes in organisms are reflected in the development of the fetuses of organisms, right? So, and I think you've probably all heard this, that this idea that we kind of go through evolutionary stage as the embryo is developing from fertilization through to birth, then that animals or humans go through a kind of evolutionary sequence, and this idea has been sort of floating out there, or it was definitely present in biology 100 years ago. So that what happened over evolutionary time in terms of millions of years gets recapitulated in terms of the development of an embryo of an animal or a human as it develops. So and this idea of recapitulation actually in terms of mainstream biology was thrown out a long time ago. No, biologists no longer think this. They do have some sort of there are some remnants of the recapitulation theory in biology and evolutionary biology, but as a basic idea, it's no longer thought to be relevant, essentially. But the idea of recapitulation did sort of spread into other fields and other domains, and this is reflected in Wilber's model. So in Wilber's model, what we do is the suggestion is that in a sort of, I suppose, a psychological sense, in terms of psychological development, then the psychological development of a human from birth on through to maturity, and this is described by Piaget, but it's described in spiral dynamics. This development of stages that we go through is reflected. So that's in one life, is reflected the same state. You can see the same stages of development happening at a cultural level over long periods of time. So this is the basic assumption of Wilber, is that societies and cultures go through developmental stages just as an individual does in an individual life, right? So, and this is a sort of a basic assumption of Wilber's model, that the stages that an individual goes through are reflected in culture at large, right? And so we can go back and we can go look at the stages of development of our culture, and Wilber does this, especially in Up from Eden, and see those same developmental stages in an individual's development from birth to maturity, right? And so this is that these things would parallel one another, that you'd see the same stages, is a basic premise, it seems to me, a basic assumption that's present in Wilber's model. And the question of these kinds of premises is, is there a reason to believe that they're correct or true? And of course, Wilber would argue, yes, of course, this is obviously true. And I would suggest that chances are it's far from obvious that this is true. That an individual's so it's no longer true in developmental biology, for example. That's been thrown out 100 years ago. But in terms of psychology and psychological development of individuals and societies, does the development of an individual in one single life go through similar stages to what society has gone through over thousands of years? Do they go through the same stages? Honestly, I have no idea, and I'm not sure what the evidence for that would be, and I imagine you can argue it both ways. But nevertheless, this would be a legitimate criticism of the will model, that it depends on some basic premises like this one, that we have to establish their veracity. And there's probably very good reasons for questioning these basic assumptions, even though they do lead to interesting stories that sort of cause interesting lines of thought and inquiry. So these ideas are provocative and useful, but are they actually true? We don't know. And one could go into researching that issue quite deeply, and I'm sure you can find arguments either way. So perhaps one way to proceed would be just, well, let's say there's some truth in it, and we'll play the game and go along with it, and see where that takes us. But I'm pretty sure that there are good reasons for caveats and good reasons to question that basic assumption. And perhaps we really shouldn't be treating the development of an individual and equating that with long-term societal or cultural development. Perhaps we shouldn't be doing that. Perhaps that misleads us. And I'm not sure, but it could easily mislead us. So to assume that in the distant past, this kind of feeds into the pre-trans fallacy, because what we do is assume that in the distant past, the ancient man was in a kind of infantile state of development, right, in terms of consciousness or psychology. So ancient man is infantile, and that includes actually today. And here we're starting to get into the territory of where we'll be challenging Wilber is indigenous peoples. Same thing. They're in a more primitive state of consciousness or psychology, because again we're more infantile. So we're equating the individual development from infant to maturity apparently with cultural development, and so we end up placing indigenous peoples at the sort of infantile level of an individual's development. This is what happens in Wilber's model, and there's a lot of people, like me included, when I immediately saw that, it was a red flag for me, and a place to wonder about Wilber's model as a whole, and whether it's not ultimately built on a poor foundation. And this would take us into the pre-trans fallacy, which he's using to support this view that ancient man or indigenous humans are at at a what you might call a pre-rational level, more infantile, younger level. So you're essentially equating a 3-year-old with the consciousness and psychology of a 3-year-old with indigenous humans, and I'm not sure that this is valid ultimately, and it's something that I originally found quite offensive. But I don't want to bias you against Wilbur because there's still so much to be gained from what he's done, what he's brought together here. That it's I guess the caution that I have is to be careful about throwing a baby out with the bathwater kind of thing. So so that's what I guess. So I tried to explain more about the AQUAL model earlier, and then this is starting in on a criticism of Wilbur from some of the basic premises, leading us into the pre-trans fallacy and the criticism based on that. And we have essentially the fundamentals of that criticism currently. Okay, hope you're having a good week. I do want to set up a time to do a Zoom meeting with you guys. Unfortunately, I'm traveling starting Wednesday morning really early this week. So it may be something that we want to set up for next week, and then we'll get into perhaps a regular routine of doing Zoom calls. Okay, bye. Bye, everyone.